There is a door in the side of a hill, far out in the desert, and it has been closed for a very long time. The sand has drifted against it. The wind has worn the stone. Above it, the sky is enormous and empty, and below it, the land runs away in low golden waves toward a river you cannot see from here. Nothing moves. Nothing has moved for thousands of years. And behind that door, in the dark, someone is waiting. They have been waiting since before Rome. They have been waiting since before the first word of the Bible was written down. Kingdoms have risen and fallen above their head, and armies have crossed this desert, and the world has changed beyond all recognition. And still they lie there in the dark, wrapped in linen, surrounded by everything they thought they would need. Tonight we are going to open that door, slowly, gently. And we're going to try to understand the strangest and most beautiful question that this ancient people ever asked, which is this: what do you do with the ones you love when they die? Because the answer they gave was unlike any other answer in all of history. They did not simply bury their dead and walk away. They spent 70 days preparing a single body. They built mountains of stone to hold it. They filled its resting place with bread and beer and furniture and games and boats. They painted its walls with fields of grain and rivers full of fish. They wrote out, on rolls of reed, the very words it would need to speak in the darkness. And they did all of this for one reason. They did not believe that death was the end. They believed it was a journey. And no one, they thought, should have to make that journey alone, or unprepared, or without a light. Before we go any further, if these quiet journeys into the far past bring you some peace at the end of the day, take a moment to subscribe, so that another one can find its way to you soon. And I would like to know, from wherever you happen to be resting tonight, where in the world are you listening from and what hour has it reached where you are? Leave it in the comments below, and then settle back and let your breathing slow, and let the ancient world come up around you like the desert at evening, wide and warm and very, very old. Now, let us begin where they began, not with death, but with the river. Everything in that world began with the river. It came up out of the far south, out of lands they did not know, and it ran north through a country of stone and sand, and along its banks it laid down a narrow strip of black earth, so rich and dark and full of life that anything you planted in it would grow. That strip was Egypt. It was never more than a few miles wide in most places, a green ribbon in a wilderness of sand, and every living thing in that kingdom clung to it. They called their land the Black Land, after the dark soil that the river gave them. And beyond it, on both sides, rising up out of the green and stretching away to the ends of the earth, was the Red Land, the desert, the place where nothing grew and nothing lived and no man went without good cause. Black and red, life and its opposite. And the border between them was so sharp that a man could stand with 1 foot in each. On this side, the sound of water and the smell of growing things. On that side, silence and heat and the endless dunes going on forever. It was on that far side, in the Red Land, that they buried their dead. They had their reasons. The Black Land was precious and every handful of it was needed for grain. You did not waste good soil on graves, and the desert was already the place of the dead in their minds, dry and still and empty, the country the sun passed through when it went down in the evening and vanished from the world. So they carried their dead out past the last green field, out where the ground turned hard and pale, and there they dug them shallow graves in the sand and laid them down on their sides with their knees drawn up, as if they were only sleeping, and set a few small things beside them and covered them over. And then something happened that changed everything, because the desert, as it turns out, does not let go. The sand of that country is hot and bone dry, and when a body is laid in it, the sand draws out every drop of moisture, quickly, thoroughly, before anything can begin to spoil. The flesh does not rot. It shrinks and darkens and hardens, and it stays. The skin remains. The hair remains. The shape of the face remains. So when a grave was opened again, by wind, or by animals, or by the hand of a man, the person inside was still there. Not bones, not dust. Them, their face, their hands, their hair, dried and dark and unmistakable, lying in the sand exactly as they had been laid down. Imagine standing in that hot silence and looking down into an open grave and seeing your grandmother's face. Not a skeleton. Her face. Sunken, changed, but hers. We cannot know for certain what the first people to see such a thing thought about it, but we can guess. And the guess is that it did not look like death to them. It looked like waiting. That, it seems, is where the whole enormous idea began. Out there in the Red Land, in a simple hole in the sand, with a body that would not decay. The desert had shown them something, and they never forgot it. If the body could last, then perhaps the person could last. And if the person could last, then death was not a wall. It was a door. Everything that came after, all the linen and the salt and the golden masks and the mountains of stone, all of it was an attempt to do on purpose what the sand had done by accident. Now, to understand why they cared so much about the body, you have to understand what they thought a person was. To them, a human being was not one single thing. A person was made of several parts, and they fitted together in life the way the parts of a house fit together, and at death they came apart, and each one had to be looked after. There was the body, of course, the thing you could touch, the house that the rest of it lived in. There was the name. A name was not just a label to them. A name was a piece of you, a real and living thing, and as long as your name was spoken aloud in the world, you were not entirely gone. To have your name erased from your tomb, chiseled off the wall, forgotten by the living, was a true and terrible loss, and so they carved their names everywhere, deep into the stone, over and over, so that they might be remembered and spoken and kept alive. There was the shadow which followed you all your life and was somehow part of you. And then there were the two great pieces of the soul, and these are the ones that mattered most. One of them was the traveler. It was pictured as a bird with a human face, and it was the part of you that could leave the body and go out into the world and fly. By day, it was said, it went out from the tomb, out into the sunlight, and it wandered the places it had loved. And at night it came home. It came back down into the dark of the tomb, back to the body, to rest. And this is exactly why the body had to be kept, because the traveler needed something to come home to. It needed to find its own body, lying there, whole and recognizable, and settle back into it and rest through the night. If the body was gone, if it had rotted away or been destroyed or scattered, then the bird would come back at dusk and find nothing. It would have no home. It would be lost, wandering, unhoused, forever. That was the fear, not the grave, the homelessness. And there was another piece of the soul, a kind of double, a spirit that stayed with the body in the tomb and needed to be fed. Not fed with real bread, exactly, but with the offerings that were left, and with the images of food painted on the walls, and with the words spoken by the living. This is why the tombs were stocked like pantries. It was not superstition in their eyes. It was a family feeding someone who was still in some sense there. So hold all of that in your mind, softly as we go on. A body that must be kept, a bird that must find its way home at dusk, a name that must be spoken, a spirit that must be fed. That was a person, to them. And every strange and elaborate thing they did with their dead was an act of care toward those fragile pieces, so that none of them would be lost. It is, when you sit with it, an extraordinary kind of love. It says, "We will not let you fall apart. We will hold you together. We will keep every piece of you safe until you are whole again." Now the sand had done its work for free. But as the centuries passed, the people grew richer, and their kings grew mightier, and they began to want more for their dead than a hole in the desert. They began to build. At first the tombs were simple, a pit dug down into the rock, and over it a low rectangular building of mud brick, flat-topped and solid, like a bench of earth standing alone in the desert. The body went down into the chamber below, the offerings went into the rooms above, and the whole thing sat there on the sand, square and heavy, marking the place where someone lay. But here is the strange irony of it, and it is worth pausing on. The moment they started building proper tombs, the bodies started rotting, because a body sealed in a stone chamber, lifted up out of the sand, laid in a coffin with air around it, is no longer being dried by the desert. It is being left in the dark, in the damp of its own flesh, to do what bodies do. The very act of honoring the dead with a fine tomb was destroying them. So they had to learn to do by hand what the sand had done by nature. And that learning took centuries. It was slow, and it was full of failure, and it was pursued with a patience that is hard for us to imagine. Generation after generation of priests and craftsmen worked at the problem and passed on what they knew and tried again and slowly over hundreds of years. They got better at it. They tried wrapping the body tightly in linen soaked in resin so that the shape of the person was preserved even as the flesh beneath was lost. They tried packing the body. They tried oils and gums and salts. They learned at last that the great enemy was water, that everything soft in the body carries water, and water is what allows the slow ruin to begin, and so the water must be taken out. And once they understood that, the whole craft fell into place. Meanwhile, above ground, the tombs were growing. One king, wanting something greater than the low, flat tomb his fathers had built, ordered his architect to stack them, one upon another, each smaller than the last, 6 great steps of stone climbing up into the sky above the desert. It was the first great building of cut stone that the world had ever seen, and when it was finished, it stood higher than anything any human eye had ever looked upon. And once a man had built a staircase to the sky, others wanted to go further. They filled in the steps. They smoothed the sides. They built higher and truer and more perfectly, until the shape resolved itself into that clean and impossible triangle we all know, rising out of the sand with its point in the sun. Which brings us to a thing that most people never think about. The pyramids are tombs. That is all they are. That is what they were for. Those vast mountains of stone, the last of the ancient wonders, the shape carved into 1,000 pieces of jewelry and printed on 1,000,000 postcards, were built for one purpose: to hold a body, to be a house for the dead. Everything we have been talking about, the drying and the wrapping and the keeping of the pieces of a soul, all of it happened inside those stones. We think of them as monuments. To the people who raised them, they were doorways, and the shape mattered. It was not chosen for beauty alone. Look at the sun in that country when it breaks through cloud, and you will see it, the great slanting rays coming down to the earth in a wide triangle of light. They saw that too, and they thought of that shining slope as a ramp, a road, a stairway on which a dead king might climb up out of the world and take his place among the stars that circle in the north and never set. The pyramid was that slope, made solid, made permanent, made of stone so that it would never fade when the clouds moved on. So when you look at one of those things now, standing there in the haze at the edge of the desert with the traffic and the tour buses at its feet, try to see it as they saw it. Not a monument, a ladder, built for one man to climb out of the dark into the light. Rest there a moment, the huge quiet shape against a sky going gold, the heat coming up off the sand, the long shadow reaching out across the desert floor. There is nowhere you need to be tonight. There is only the stone and the sun going down, and 4,500 years lying between you and the hand that set the last block in place. Now let us go inside, not into the pyramid, into the small quiet building at the edge of the town where the real work was done. It stood a little apart from the houses. It was not a place the living went without reason. Inside there were low tables of stone and jars and rolls of linen and the sharp, clean smell of salt and resin and sweet oil. And here, when someone died, they were carried in and laid down, and the 70 days began. 70 days. Think of that. From the first washing to the last wrapping, more than 2 months of steady, patient, unhurried labor over one person. Not for a king, for anyone whose family could pay for it. 70 days of care. The priests who did this work were a class apart. It was often a trade passed from father to son, held in a strange mixture of honor and unease by everyone else. The way we might regard those who tend the dead today. They knew the prayers. They knew the order of every act. They carried a weight that most of us never have to carry, because the families who gave their dead into these hands believed, truly believed, that the skill of these men might decide the fate of a soul forever. And in the most sacred moments of the work, one of them put on a mask. It was the long black head of a desert dog, with tall ears and a narrow muzzle, and when a man lowered it over his own head, he became for a while something more than a man. He became the god, the one who watched over the dead. And it was the god, then, and not merely a priest who bent over the body and began the work. We know these masks were real because one of them has come down to us. It sits in a museum now in a glass case, hollowed inside to rest upon a man's shoulders with slits cut so that he could see out. And when you stand in front of it, you are looking at the last face that the dead of that country saw, the face that leaned over them at the very end before the linen went on and the dark came down. Across all those centuries, the dog still looks back at you. Now, what actually happened in those 70 days? First, they washed the body, simply gently with water carried up from the river, the same water the person had drunk all their life. There were prayers over even this. Then came the careful opening and the removal of the soft parts within, the things that carry water and would ruin everything if they stayed. This was done with skill and with reverence, and every act had its words to be spoken over it. The organs were not thrown away. Nothing that belonged to a person was ever simply thrown away because a person had to be kept whole. So the pieces were preserved separately, each one, and placed in 4 stone jars that would stand beside the body in the tomb forever. And each jar had a carved head upon its lid, and each head was a guardian. And each guardian watched over one piece of the person until the day they should be whole again. Those 4 jars are worth pausing on, because they are among the most beautiful things that come out of these tombs, and you have almost certainly seen them without knowing what you are looking at. They stand together, 4 of them side by side in a low stone chest, carved from alabaster or limestone or fired from clay. And each lid is a head. One is the head of a man, one is a hawk, one is a baboon, and one is the long, narrow head of a desert dog. Each of those 4 was a guardian, a son of a great god, and each one was given a single piece of the person to watch over, and each was placed facing a particular direction, so that between them they covered the whole compass of the world. North, south, east, west. Whichever way trouble came from, one of them was already looking that way. And behind those 4 stood 4 goddesses, each with her arms spread wide, each wrapped around one side of the chest, holding it, guarding what was inside, which means that in the corner of that dark chamber, for 4,000 years, 8 divine figures have been standing watch over 4 small jars, so that a person might one day be put back together, whole and unbroken, exactly as they were. Nobody was ever meant to see it. That is the thing. It was sealed in the dark, and it was supposed to stay there forever. They did it anyway. They did it perfectly. They did it for an audience of no one, out of pure faith that it mattered. There was one part they did discard, and it is the part that surprises people most, the soft matter inside the head. They did not think it held anything of worth, no memory, no self, no soul, and so it was drawn out through the nose with a long, thin hook of bronze, slowly, with a delicacy that is hard to imagine, and the skull was rinsed clean and filled with resin. Because they thought the seat of a person was somewhere else entirely. They thought it was the heart. To them, the heart was the mind. It was where you thought and where you remembered and where you decided and where your character lived. The heart was who you were. And so the heart was the one thing they left inside the body, sitting in its place in the chest, wrapped and protected and never taken out. It was left there because it would be needed later, at the end of the journey. But that is the story of the second half of this, and we will come to it in time. And then came the salt. There is a mineral in that country, a natural salt that gathers in dry lake beds out in the desert, white and coarse and hungry for water. They gathered it by the sackload, and they brought it to the embalming house, and they packed the body in it, inside and out, buried it in the stuff, heaped it over and around, until nothing was left uncovered. And then they walked away, and they let it work, and they waited 40 days. 40 days of stillness in a dark, dry room, the body lying under its white weight, giving up its water grain by grain, hour by hour, day by day. The seasons turning outside, the river rising or falling, the family in mourning at home, waiting, counting. Let yourself rest in that stillness for a moment. There is no hurry in it. Nothing is being rushed. There is only patience and salt and time doing quietly what time does. Let your own breathing slow to that pace, in and out. 40 days of the world simply turning, while the desert does its ancient work. When the 40 days were done, they came back and uncovered the body. What lay there was changed. It was smaller, it was dark, it was dry and light and hard, and all the softness of life had gone out of it. But it was still, unmistakably, a person. And now it would not rot. Now it could last, not for years, but for thousands of years, which is exactly what it has done, and which is why we can look at these faces today. Then began the making beautiful, and this is the part that always moves me most, because it was so clearly done with love. They washed the body again. They rubbed it with sweet oils and warm resins to soften the skin and to give it a fragrance and to keep the linen from sticking. They packed the hollows gently with linen and with sawdust and with sweet-smelling things, filling out the sunken places, giving back the shape of a living person. Sometimes they put in false eyes so the closed lids would not sink. Sometimes they laid on a coat of resin to strengthen the skin. They combed the hair. In some cases, they even painted the face and body, red for a man, pale gold for a woman, the way they had been painted in life. They were making them ready, not for a coffin, for a homecoming. They wanted that bird, when it came down at dusk, to recognize the face it was looking for. And then the wrapping began, and the wrapping took days. Long strips of the finest linen, hundreds and hundreds of yards of it, sometimes the very sheets and clothing from the person's own home, torn and cut and rolled for this purpose. They began with the fingers, each finger separately, then each toe, then each limb, then the limbs bound to the body, around and around and around, layer upon layer, in a set and sacred order, with resin brushed between the layers to hold it all fast. And as they wrapped, they hid things in the linen. Amulets, small charms, dozens of them in a rich burial, each one placed at a particular point on the body, each with its own power to guard and to heal and to protect. A charm at the throat, a charm at the incision, charms on the fingers, a pillar shape at the spine for strength, a knot of red stone for the blood, and over the heart, the greatest of them all, a charm carved in the shape of a beetle. They had watched a certain beetle rolling its ball across the sand, and had seen in it a picture of the sun being rolled across the sky and reborn each dawn. And so that little creature had become a sign of coming back, of rising again, of the morning after the darkness. That beetle went over the heart, and on its underside very often was written a small prayer, quiet and almost frightened, asking the heart not to speak against its owner on the day of judgment. Do not stand up as a witness. Do not turn away from me. Do not tell them what I did, which tells you something rather human about these people. They were not certain. They hoped and they feared, and they wrote a little plea to their own heart, and they wrapped it up in linen next to their chest, and they went into the dark hoping it would hold. At last the wrapped body was covered with a shroud, and a mask was laid over the face. The mask was made in the likeness of the person, or at least in the likeness of a person, idealized, calm, eyes wide open, staring straight ahead into forever. For the rich it was made of layers of linen and plaster, painted and gilded. For a king, it might be beaten from solid gold. The purpose was not vanity. The purpose was recognition. The mask was a spare face. If anything happened to the real one, if the linen slipped, if time did its worst, the soul would still have a face to come back to, still know its own body, still find its way home. And then the coffin, which was itself a work of years, painted inside and out, covered with the figures of protecting gods, with their wings spread wide, wrapped around the body as if holding it, covered with words, thousands of words, spells and prayers and directions, written where the dead could read them, on the underside of the lid on the floor beneath the body, so that the traveler would never be without a map. They even painted a pair of eyes on the outside of the coffin, at the level of the face so that the one inside could look out. Everything in it, every stroke, was a message. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. Here are the words you will need. Here are the gods who will hold you. Here is a face, and here are eyes, and here is everything we could think of to give you. Now, everything I have described to you cost money, a great deal of it. The 70 days, the salt by the sackload, the finest linen, hundreds of yards of it, the imported resins carried down from the hills of distant lands at enormous expense, the amulets carved from stone and glass, the painted coffin, the gilded mask, the tomb cut into rock, the walls plastered and painted, the little servants carved by the hundred. That was the burial of a wealthy man, and there were never very many wealthy men. So the priests offered a lesser version and a lesser one after that. For a family of modest means, the work was quicker, the linen coarser, the oils simpler, the coffin plain and undecorated, fewer amulets, fewer days. And for the poor, for the great mass of people who worked the fields and carried the water and hauled the stone, there was no embalming house at all. There was only the desert. They went out as their ancestors had gone out, thousands of years before, and they were laid in the hot sand at the edge of the Red Land in a simple pit, with perhaps a jar and a few beads and a little food beside them. And the sand did what the sand had always done. It dried them, and it kept them, and it held them safe without any craft or any cost at all. There is something quietly fair about that when you think of it. The king in his mountain of stone, sealed behind granite doors, guarded by spells and gold, and the farmer in his shallow bed of sand out under the open sky. And both of them, 4,000 years later, still here, still preserved, still recognizable. The desert never charged anyone a thing, and they did not stop with people. This is one of the strangest and most extraordinary parts of the whole story, and it has left behind mountains of evidence, quite literally. They mummified animals, millions of them. Some were beloved pets, prepared with real tenderness and buried at their owner's feet, so that a man might have his dog again on the other side. There are cats wrapped with as much care as any child, and monkeys and gazelles, and one queen's pet baboon. Some were food, prepared for the tomb the way you might pack a lunch for a long journey. Whole ducks and joints of beef, dried and wrapped in linen and laid in little coffins shaped to fit them, so the dead would have something good to eat. But most of them, the overwhelming, staggering, unbelievable majority of them, were offerings. Because in the later centuries, if you wanted to send a message to a god, you could buy an animal sacred to that god, have it mummified and leave it at the temple as a gift. And the people did this on a scale that is difficult to hold in the mind. There are underground galleries beneath the desert, tunnel after tunnel, chamber after chamber, packed floor to ceiling with mummified cats. There are catacombs holding literally millions of mummified birds, wrapped in linen, stacked in pots, laid in rows in the dark. It became an industry. There were farms that raised the animals for the purpose. There were workshops that wrapped them by the thousand, and archaeologists have found, when they unwrap them now, that not all of them are honest. Some bundles hold only a few bones. Some hold nothing but rags and mud, wrapped up beautifully into the shape of a cat, and sold to some pilgrim who never knew. 4,000 years later, we are still opening those little linen parcels and finding now and then that someone was cheated. And one last thing before we go to the tomb, because it is a thing that gets forgotten. Someone had to dig these places. The great tombs cut into the rock, the long descending corridors, the painted chambers, all of it was carved out of solid stone by hand, by men with copper tools and stone hammers and oil lamps working in the dark, in the heat, in the dust, deep under the hill. There was a whole village of them, a walled town out in the desert, built for the workers who cut the royal tombs, and they lived there with their families for generations, and their sons took up the work after them. They were craftsmen, not slaves. They were paid in grain and fish and oil. They had names, and we know many of them because they scribbled constantly on chips of limestone, on broken pottery, notes and letters and complaints and jokes. And what those scraps tell us is wonderfully ordinary. They tell us who was absent from work and why. This one was ill. This one was brewing beer. This one was building his own house. This one was arguing with his wife. They tell us that these men who spent their lives carving eternity into the rock went home at the end of the day and ate dinner and quarreled and laughed and worried about money. And they tell us one more thing. Once, when their wages were late, they stopped working. They sat down in the desert and refused to move until they were paid. It is the first recorded labor strike in the history of the world, and it happened at the door of a king's tomb. Now the 70 days were done, and it was time to take them out to the tomb. And this was a great procession, and it was very loud, and it went through the streets in daylight for everyone to see. The coffin was drawn on a sledge, sometimes by oxen, sometimes by men, Behind it came everything the dead would take with them, carried by servants in a long line. Chairs, beds, chests of clothing, jars of oil and wine, boxes of jewelry, board games, musical instruments, weapons for a soldier, tools for a craftsman, food in enormous quantity, baskets and baskets of it, and with them came the mourners, and among them were women hired for the purpose, professional mourners, who tore their hair and threw dust upon their heads and wailed aloud, because grief that was seen and heard was grief that honored the dead. The whole town watched it pass. It was a public thing. It was meant to be. A life ending, and a life being carried out to the desert, and everyone standing in their doorways to see it go, out past the last houses, out past the last green field, out into the red land, into the heat and the silence, up the slope of the hill, to a door in the rock that stood open and waiting. And there, at the door of the tomb, they performed the most important rite of all. The coffin was set upright, standing on its feet, facing the crowd, so that the dead person seemed to be standing there among them one last time. And a priest came forward with a set of tools, small and strange-looking, and he touched them to the mouth of the mask, and to the eyes, and to the ears and the nose. They called it the opening of the mouth. The idea was simple, and it is one of the gentlest ideas I know. The body had been prepared and preserved and made whole. But it was still, in the end, a thing that could not breathe or see or speak or eat. So the priests gave those things back. They touched the mouth and said, "Now you can breathe. Now you can speak. Now you can eat the offerings we bring you." They touched the eyes and said, "Now you can see." They were switching the person back on, waking them gently into the next world, and the son of the dead man, if he had a son, was the one who was supposed to perform this rite. Which means that in that ancient country, the last thing a father received from his child was his voice, and his breath, and his eyes, handed back to him at the door of his tomb. Then the offerings were laid out, and a meal was eaten there at the graveside by the living, in the company of the dead, which was the last meal they would ever share. And then they carried everything inside. The tomb was not a hole. The tomb was a house. That is the thing to understand. It was a house built to be lived in, and it was furnished exactly as a house would be furnished, because the people who built it fully expected that someone would be living there. They put in beds and headrests. They put in chairs and stools and little tables. They put in chests full of folded linen and sandals and wigs and combs and mirrors of polished bronze. They put in cosmetics, and the jars to keep them in, and small spoons to lift them out. They put in jewelry, ring by ring and bead by bead. They put in board games, and they put them in complete, with all the pieces so that the dead could play. They put in food, bread and cakes and dried meat and fruit and jars of wine and jars of beer, sealed and stacked in the storerooms of the tomb, enough to last a very long time. They put in tiny models, little wooden workshops full of little wooden workers, baking bread, brewing beer, weaving cloth, slaughtering cattle, whole miniature farms, whole miniature kitchens, little boats with little rowers, so the dead could sail the river again. And they put in the servants, not real ones. Small figures carved from wood or molded from clay, sometimes a handful, sometimes hundreds of them, laid in rows in boxes, because they believed that in the fields of the next world there would be work to do, ditches to dig and grain to carry, and no one wanted their beloved dead to labor there. So these little figures were given a name that meant the ones who answer. When the dead were called upon to work, the figures would step forward and answer in their place and do it for them, and let their master rest. That is such a tender thought when you sit with it. They loved their dead so much that they could not bear the idea of them being tired. And on the walls they painted the world, not death, not darkness, life. They painted fields of barley standing tall and gold. They painted men fishing in the marshes with birds bursting up out of the reeds. They painted cattle being counted, and grapes being trodden, and bread being baked. They painted feasts, with musicians and dancers and tables loaded with food, and guests with cones of scented fat melting slowly over their wigs. They painted the good, ordinary, sunlit world in bright, clear colors on the walls of a room that would be sealed in total darkness forever. And they did it because paintings to them were not decoration. A painting was a kind of promise, a thing made real by being made. To paint a field of grain on the wall of the tomb was to give the dead a field of grain. To paint a table of bread and beer was to set that table for them permanently, so that even if every living relative forgot them, even if no offerings ever came again, the dead would not go hungry. They were furnishing eternity item by item with enormous care, for someone they would never see again. Then everything was in place, the jars in their niches, the food in the storeroom, the little servants in their boxes, the coffin in its stone chest and the lid lowered onto it, sealing the sleeper into the dark. And the family came out, back into the blinding sun, and the masons closed the door behind them and pressed the wet clay of the seals over the joint, and stamped it with the mark that would show to anyone who came after that this door was not to be opened. And they walked back down the hill, into the green land, into the noise and the sunlight and the business of being alive. Behind them, in the dark, in a house made of stone, someone lay in perfect stillness, wrapped in linen, wearing a golden face, with a small stone beetle over their heart. Surrounded by bread and beer and games and boats and hundreds of little servants standing ready to answer. Everything was ready. The body was safe. The name was carved in the wall. The face was there to be recognized. The food was on the table. The words were written on the coffin in careful rows, waiting to be read. And now the real journey was about to begin, because everything you have heard so far, all 70 days of it, all the salt and the linen and the little charms and the golden face, all of it was only the packing of a bag. None of it was the journey. The body was the vessel. And the tomb was the harbor, and the ship had not yet left. Somewhere in that sealed darkness, in the stillness behind the clay seals, the traveler was waking. And ahead lay a road that no living person had ever walked and returned from, a country of gates and guardians and long dark water, where every step had to be taken with the right word on your lips. And at the end of that road, there was a room, and in that room there was a set of scales. And on those scales one day a heart would be weighed. We will go there next, down through the gates, through the dark, all the way to the hall where it is decided. But not yet, not tonight, and not just now. For the moment, let it be enough that everything is ready. The door is sealed, the lamps are out. The house of stone stands quiet in the desert with the stars coming out above it. And inside, everything that love could think to give has been given and set in its place and left in the dark. Rest there a while, in the cool and the quiet, under the enormous sky, at the edge of the red land, with the whole long journey still ahead. So the door is sealed, and the desert is quiet, and the last of the mourners have gone back down the hill toward the green land and the sound of the river. And inside, in the absolute dark, in a house of stone that no one will ever visit again, the journey begins. Now, everything you have heard so far was preparation. The salt, the linen, the golden face, the 4 jars with their watching heads, the little servants standing in their boxes, the bread and the beer and the board games laid out on the floor of a room that will never see the sun again. All of that was the packing of a bag. Tonight we follow the traveler. We go down, past the sealed door, past the coffin lid, past the body lying still in its wrappings with a small stone beetle over its heart, and out into a country that no living person has ever seen and come back from. A land of gates and guardians and long dark water, where the road runs for 12 hours through the night, and where nothing can be won without the right word spoken at the right moment. And at the end of it there is a room, and in that room there are scales. And on those scales, before this night is over, a heart is going to be weighed. Settle in. Let your shoulders come down. There is nothing you need to do tonight but follow and breathe, and let the darkness be gentle. And if these long journeys into the ancient world help you rest, do subscribe so another one can find you when you need it. Now, come with me, down into the hidden land. The first thing to understand is that the traveler did not go empty-handed. Beside the body in the coffin or tucked into the wrappings or laid in a hollow inside a small painted statue, there was very often a roll of reed paper. Sometimes it was short, sometimes it was longer than the room it was buried in, 20, 30, 60 feet of it, rolled up tight and covered from end to end in tiny, beautiful writing, with brightly painted pictures set in among the lines. We call this the Book of the Dead, but that is our name for it, and it is a poor one, and it misses the whole spirit of the thing. Their name for it was the Book of Coming Forth by Day. Sit with that for a moment. Coming forth by day. Not a book of endings, a book of mornings. The whole point of it, the entire hope contained in those long painted rolls, was that the one who carried it would pass through the darkness and come out the other side into the light, and go on coming out morning after morning forever. And it was not a story. It was not scripture in the way we might think of scripture. It was, to put it plainly, a set of instructions. It was a manual. It was a handbook for the most difficult journey there is, written by people who had never made it, for people who were about to. It contained spells, words of power, things to say and when to say them, what to do if a serpent comes at you, what to say when a gate will not open, how to answer when something enormous asks you your name, how to keep your heart from betraying you, how to breathe, how to remember who you are. And here is the thing that always stops me. The rolls were often made in advance by professional scribes and sold ready-made with blank spaces left in them. Blank spaces where the buyer's name would later be written in. So you could walk into a shop in that ancient country and buy your own guide to the afterlife off the shelf, and the scribe would ask your name and dip his reed and fill in the blanks. Some of these rolls, when we unwrap them now, still have the blanks. Empty, never filled. Someone bought their map and then died before their name could be written on it, and went down into the dark, carrying a book that did not know who they were. The country they were entering had a name. It meant roughly the hidden place, the land under the world. And it was not a pit, and it was not a lake of fire, and it was not really punishment at all in the way that later ages would imagine such places. It was a country, a vast, dark, strange country, with a river running through it, and hills and fields and walls and gates and towns of a sort, all of it lying under the earth in the dark, on the far side of the western horizon where the sun went down. Because that was the key to the whole picture, the sun. Every evening, they watched the sun sink into the western desert and vanish. Every morning they watched it climb up out of the eastern desert, red and new. And in between, for 12 hours, it was somewhere. It was down there. It was traveling through the hidden land, in a boat in the dark, on that black underground river fighting its way east toward the dawn. That was the journey. And the dead traveled with it. So picture that now. A long, low boat on black water, moving slowly through a darkness with no stars in it. In the middle of the boat, a light, not a lamp. The sun itself, worn down, old and tired, an old man at the end of his day, riding through the underworld on his way to be born again in the morning. Around him a crew, gods with the heads of animals standing at the oars, holding spears, watching the banks. And on the banks, in the dark, on either side of that black river, things are moving. The hidden land had 12 gates, one for each hour of the night, and every gate was guarded. The guardians were not gentle. They are painted on tomb walls and written into the spells, and they are strange beyond anything our films have ever managed to invent. Figures with the heads of crocodiles and the bodies of men, holding long knives. Serpents with human legs. Serpents with wings. Figures whose faces are turned backward. Guardians who breathe fire. Guardians who sit in the dark waiting with their blades across their knees. Guardians whose names are things like the one who lives on maggots, or the one who dances in blood, or the backward-facing one who came from the pit. They are terrifying, and they were meant to be. But here is what matters, and here is what makes this whole system so unlike the terrors of other ages. Every one of those guardians could be passed, not by strength, not by fighting, not by any goodness of your heart at this stage, simply by knowing. At each gate the traveler stopped, and the keeper of that gate demanded to know its name. And the traveler, who had studied, who had been given the words, who carried the roll of reed paper that had cost their family so much, spoke the name of the gate, and the name of the keeper, and the name of the watcher, and the name of the herald. And the gate opened, and the traveler passed through into the next hour of the night. That is why the spells were bought. That is why they were painted on the coffins and carved into the walls and rolled into the linen. It was not decoration and it was not vanity. It was a set of passwords. It was the family saying, "Take this, you will need it. Do not forget." When the thing with the knife asks you who it is, here is what you say. And the great enemy waited in the deepest hour. Down there in the darkest part of the night, coiled across the river, blocking the way, there was an enormous serpent. It was the thing that wanted the sun to fail. Every night it lay across that black water, and every night the crew of the boat had to fight it and beat it back and cut its coils and force a passage through. And every night they won. That was the point. That was the promise. However black it got, however deep in the night, however huge the thing in the water, the boat always got through, and the sun always came up in the morning. It had never failed. Not once in all the thousands of years anyone could remember. The dawn always came. So when they lay in the dark, thinking about the road their own dead were walking, that is what they held on to. The night is long and it is full of serpents, and the light in the boat is small. And it always gets through. Rest there, on the black river, in the dark, moving slowly east. There is a small warm light in the boat ahead of you. There are hours yet to go. But the morning is coming, the way it has always come. And there is nothing at all for you to do but drift and follow the light and let the current carry you on. And then, somewhere near the end of the night, the boat comes to a landing, and the traveler steps ashore and walks up a long avenue toward a building at the far end. And this is where it stops being a journey and becomes a trial. The building is a hall. It is enormous and it is full of light after all that darkness, and it is crowded. And waiting at the entrance is a figure the traveler has met before, though they may not remember it. Tall, the body of a man. The long black head of a desert dog with its narrow muzzle and its tall listening ears. He was the one who bent over the body in the embalming house, in the mask. He was the one who wrapped it and set the charms in the linen. And now, here he is again at the far end of the world, and he does not speak and he is not cruel. And what he does is this. He takes the traveler by the hand, and he leads them in. That gesture is the whole religion, if you ask me. That single gesture. Not a judge glaring down from a throne. A guide taking a frightened soul by the hand and walking them into the hardest room they will ever enter, so that they do not have to walk in alone. The hall is called the Hall of the Two Truths, and it is lined with judges. There are 42 of them, sitting in rows down both sides, and each one is there for a single kind of wrong. And the traveler must walk down that hall past every one of them, and speak to each in turn and say what they have not done. I have not stolen, I have not killed, I have not lied, I have not taken milk from the mouths of children, I have not caused pain, I have not been deaf to words of truth, I have not made anyone weep, I have not stopped water when it should have flowed, I have not spoken with a loud voice in anger, I have not polluted myself. On and on, 42 times, down the whole length of that hall, a person standing before the assembled judges of the world and giving an account of a life. And notice what is on that list. Read it again in your mind. Almost none of it is about ritual or about believing the right things, or about honoring the right God in the right way. Nearly all of it is about how you treated other people. Did you feed the hungry? Did you cheat anyone? Did you cause pain? Did you make someone cry? Did you lie about a neighbor? Did you take more water than your share when your neighbor's field was dry? 4,500 years ago, in a hall painted on the wall of a tomb, in a language that had not been read for 2,000 years until we learned it again, a human being stands before the judges of eternity and says quietly, "I did not make anyone weep." That was the standard. That is what they thought mattered. And in all the centuries since, with everything we have learned and built and become, I am not sure we have ever improved on it. And then the traveler reaches the end of the hall, and there is a pause here, and it is worth sitting in it because the ancient painters always drew this moment as if everything had gone very quiet. Everyone in the hall stops. The 42 judges are still. The guide with the dog's head steps forward, and at the far end of the room waiting is the lord of that country, the one who sits on the throne of the dead, wrapped like a mummy himself, holding a crook and a flail across his chest, his skin painted green like new growth, like something that has come back. because he had died too. That was the whole point of him. He had been killed and torn apart and put back together with linen and love. And he had risen, and now he sat here and welcomed everyone who came after him along the same road. He does not speak. He does not need to. He simply waits on his throne at the end of the hall while the thing that must be done is done. And the scales are there. They are enormous. A tall balance standing upright in the middle of the floor with two pans hanging from a beam, perfectly still. And the guide with the dog's head steps forward, and he reaches into the traveler's chest gently, and he takes out the heart. That heart, the one they left in the body on purpose all those 70 days ago, the one they wrapped and protected and never removed, the one with the little stone beetle laid over it, carrying its quiet, frightened prayer, "Do not stand as a witness against me, do not turn away from me, do not say what I did," because the heart, to them, was not a pump. The heart was the record. The heart was where every choice you ever made had been quietly written down, all your life without your permission. And he sets it in one pan of the scales, and in the other pan he lays a single feather, not a stone, not a weight, not another heart, a feather plucked from the head of the goddess who holds the whole world in its proper order, the goddess of truth and balance and justice, and the way things ought to be. She is called Mut, and her feather is the standard against which the entire life of a human being is measured. And the question is very simple. Is your heart light? Not is it good, exactly. Not is it pure. Is it light? Has it been dragged down over the years by the weight of everything you did and did not do? Is it heavier than truth? Nearby stands another god, with the long curved beak of a wading bird. And he holds a reed pen and a writing board, and he is going to write down the result, and there will be no appeal. And crouching at the foot of the scales, close enough to touch them, absolutely still, there is a creature. It has the head of a crocodile, the front of a lion, the back of a river horse. It is a stitched-together nightmare made of the three animals that could actually kill you in that country. And it sits there and it watches the pan with the heart in it, and it waits. They called it the Devourer, because if the heart came down heavy, if the life had been cruel or false or full of harm, then the heart was taken from the scale and given to that waiting thing, and it was eaten. And that was the end, not fire, not torment, not an eternity of punishment somewhere, just an ending. The heart is eaten, and the person stops. They cease. They do not go on to the fields, and they do not come back to the tomb. And the little bird with the human face never comes home at dusk again, because there is nothing left of them to come home. That was the thing they were truly afraid of, not death. They had made their peace with death and prepared for it and furnished it like a house. What they were afraid of was the second death, the one after death, the one where you simply stop existing. And now hold the picture. The heart in one pan, the feather in the other, the dog-headed god with his hand on the beam, steady and careful, making sure the weighing is true. The bird-headed scribe with his pen ready, the judges in their rows, the devourer waiting absolutely still, and the beam of the scale trembling and settling, and it is level. The heart and the feather balance. The life was not perfect, because no life is, and they knew that, and the scales were never asking for perfection. They were asking whether on the whole weighed honestly this person had been decent, whether they had fed anyone, whether they had made anyone weep, whether they had left the world a little heavier or a little lighter than they found it. And the beam holds level. The scribe writes it down. The devourer settles back and closes its eyes. And the guide takes the traveler by the hand again and leads them forward past the scales, past the judges, through a door at the far end of the hall. And on the other side of that door, there is sunlight. They called it the Field of Reeds. And here is what I love about it, and here is what tells you everything about these people. It is not a palace, it is not a city of gold. It is not a choir of light or a throne room or a place of clouds and harps. It is a farm. It is the exact country they already lived in, only perfect. There is a river, and it is clear and full of fish. There are fields, and the barley grows tall and heavy and gold, and it never fails, and the harvest is always good. There are date palms. There are cattle standing in the shade. There is a house, and there is a boat tied at the bank, and there is a wife, and there is a husband, and there are the ones who went before you waiting, and you work in those fields. That is the thing. You still work, you plow, and you sow, and you reap. But the work is good, and it is never desperate, and the sun is warm, and the water always comes, and the grain always grows. They did not want to escape their world. They loved their world. They loved the river, and the mud, and the smell of bread, and their families, and the way the light came up over the desert in the morning. They loved it so much that the best thing they could imagine, the greatest reward that eternity could possibly offer, was to have it again, and to have it forever, and to have it without fear. And they buried little wooden servants in their tombs to do the digging for them anyway, because a farm is still a farm. There is one more detail about that place, and it is my favorite thing in this entire story. The fields of that country were watered by canals, and the canals had to be cleared, and the ditches had to be dug, and any farmer will tell you that this is the worst work there is. Hot, wet, back-breaking, endless. And when they painted the field of reeds on the walls of their tombs, they painted the canals in too. They could have imagined anything. They were building the picture of paradise from nothing, with a free hand, and they could have put in whatever they wanted. And what they chose to include in heaven was irrigation ditches, because it would not have been home without them. It would not have been the river and the mud and the green land and the smell of water going into a dry field. It would have been somebody else's idea of a good place, and they did not want somebody else's good place. They wanted theirs, all of it. The hard bits too, that was the deal. That was the hope. Get through the night, answer the gates, keep your heart light, and you get your life back, the good parts, the sunlit parts, with everyone you love, beside a river that never runs dry. Now let us come back up. Out of the hall, out of the hidden land, back through the 12 gates, back up the Black River, back into the world, into the desert, into the daylight, to that sealed door in the side of the hill. Because we have to talk about what actually happened. They did everything right. They dried the body and wrapped it and gave it a golden face. They cut a chamber into solid rock and hid it and sealed it, and stamped the clay with the seals of the dead. They stocked it with food and furniture and games and boats and hundreds of little servants standing ready to answer. They wrote the words on the walls. They carved the name deep into the stone so it could be spoken forever. And then, within a generation, sometimes within a year, sometimes within weeks, men came up that same hill in the dark with copper chisels and torches and broke the seals and went in. And they learned. That is the part people forget. They watched it happen, and they changed their whole way of burying kings because of it. Think about a pyramid for a second, with the eye of a thief. It is the largest object in the landscape. It is visible from a day's walk away. It is a gigantic stone arrow pointing at the ground and saying, "The gold is here." There is treasure under this, and everyone in the country knows it, and there is no possibility of pretending otherwise. The pyramid builders knew the danger. They tried everything. They hid the entrance and sealed it over. They filled the corridors with granite plugs weighing many tons, slid down grooves cut into the walls, so that once the burial was done, the passage was blocked by stone that could not be moved. And the robbers tunneled around them, straight through the softer rock, past the granite, into the chamber. They built false passages, dead ends, shafts that went nowhere, chambers hidden behind chambers. The robbers found them. Every trick the architects invented, someone eventually beat. Every pyramid we have ever opened, without a single exception worth the name, had been emptied long before we got there. The greatest of them, the one everybody knows, the last wonder of the ancient world, was found with nothing inside it but an empty stone box with its lid broken off. 6 million tons of stone, 20 years of a nation's labor, and it did not protect one man for even a few centuries. So they stopped. After 1,000 years of building the most conspicuous tombs in human history, the kings of that country made a decision that must have taken enormous courage, because it meant giving up the very thing their ancestors had been most famous for. They decided to hide. They went south, far up the river, and they found a valley. It was a bare, hot, dead end of a place, ringed with cliffs, with one narrow way in and out, and no water and no reason for anyone to go there. and above it, at the head of the valley, rose a natural peak in the rock, a great pyramid-shaped mountain, put there by nobody, standing over the whole place like a guardian. A pyramid that no one had to build, a pyramid that no one could rob. And beneath it, they began to cut their tombs down into the rock. No monument above, no marker, nothing on the surface at all but a hole in the ground. And once the burial was over, not even that, because the hole was filled in, and the rubble was scattered, and the desert was swept until you could not tell that anything had ever happened there. The tomb went down, stairs, and then a corridor, and then more stairs, and more corridor, driving deep into the mountain, sometimes hundreds of feet. And at the end of it, the chamber painted from floor to ceiling with the whole of the night journey. The gates and the guardians and the boat on the Black River, so that the king could read his way through the dark, straight off the walls around him. 60 and more of these tombs went into that valley, over 5 centuries. The greatest kings of the ancient world, hidden in the ground in the middle of nowhere with nothing to mark them. And it did not work either. The tombs were robbed, nearly all of them, nearly always. That is the truth that sits under this whole beautiful structure, like a crack in the foundation. For every tomb we open now and find in ruins, the ruin usually happened while the family who built it was still alive. And the robbers were not strangers. Very often they were the men who had built the place. They were the workmen from the village, the ones who had cut the corridor and plastered the walls and carried in the chests, because who else knew exactly where the chamber was, and which wall was thin, and where the gold had been stacked? We know this because they were caught, and because they were tried, and because someone wrote it down. There are records of these trials, actual court documents on reed paper, thousands of years old. The accused were questioned and beaten, and they confessed, and their confessions were taken down word for word by a scribe sitting there in the room. And what those men described is chilling in its ordinariness. They tell how they broke through. They tell how they found the king and the queen lying in the dark. They tell how they stripped the gold from the coffins and pulled the jewelry out of the wrappings, and how they set fire to the coffins to melt the gold off them faster, right there in the burial chamber. They tell how they divided the loot afterward, and how much each man got. One of them, at the end of his confession, says something that reads like a shrug across 4,000 years. He says the gold they found on the king was a great quantity, and they took it, and they shared it out among themselves. That is it. That is all. A man broke into a house built for eternity, burned a king to get the gold off him, split it with his friends, and went home. And here is the part that turns your stomach a little if you let it. The investigation was corrupt. Of course it was. There were officials on the take. There were rival administrators using the tomb robbery inquiry to attack each other, filing accusations, demanding inspections, trying to prove that the other man's district was the one where the thefts were happening. There are letters back and forth. There are inspections that found nothing in tombs we now know had already been emptied. Somebody was being paid to look the other way. And everybody knew it, and it went all the way up. So picture the whole thing at once. The old priest, 3,000 years ago, carefully rewrapping the ruined body of a king who had ruled an empire, writing the king's name on the linen in ink so that whoever came next would know who this was. And 100 yards away in an office, a bureaucrat is taking a bribe to make sure nobody looks too hard at the district where the gold is disappearing. Both of those men existed at the same time, in the same place. Doing those two things, that is what people are, that is what people have always been. And there is something almost comforting in it, at this distance. We have not fallen from anything. We were always both of those men. And this is what forced one of the strangest and saddest operations in all of history. Because eventually, hundreds of years later, the priests of that country had to face the fact that they could not protect the dead. The royal tombs were being emptied one after another. The great kings, the famous ones, the conquerors and the builders, were being torn out of their coffins and stripped in the dark. So the priests went in themselves. They went into the violated tombs, and they gathered up what was left of their kings. They rewrapped them, they repaired them, they labeled them, writing on the linen, in ink, "This is such and such a king, we restored him in such and such a year." And then they moved them secretly at night from tomb to tomb, hiding them, shifting them, trying to stay ahead of the robbers. And at last, in desperation, they took a great number of them, king after king after king, the mightiest rulers that country ever produced, and they carried them all to a single hidden shaft in a cliff, far from anything, and they lowered them down into it, one by one, and stacked them in a corridor in the dark, and they sealed it and they walked away. Kings who had built temples that still stand, kings whose names were carved into mountains, all of them in the end, hidden in a hole in a cliff like contraband by priests who had run out of ideas. And they lay there together, in that corridor in the dark, for nearly 3,000 years. But one got away. Out of all of them. Out of the 60 tombs in that valley, out of the hundreds of kings across 3,000 years, out of every pyramid and every mastaba and every hidden shaft, essentially one royal burial survived more or less intact into our own time. And it belonged to a boy. He was not a great king. He was a child who came to the throne at about 9 years old, and who died at around 19, and who did almost nothing that history bothered to record. He ruled for a decade in a difficult time, and then he was gone, and he was buried in a hurry in a small tomb that was probably not even meant for him, cramped and hastily painted, tucked into a low corner of the valley floor. And then, by pure accident, the workmen cutting a much grander tomb nearby dumped their rubble on top of him. Tons of it. Chip and stone and rubbish piled over the entrance to that small forgotten doorway, burying it completely. And there he stayed, while the valley was robbed around him, while the priests moved the great kings from hiding place to hiding place, while the country fell and Rome came and Rome fell, and the desert took everything back. For 3,200 years, a boy lay under a pile of builders' rubbish, forgotten by absolutely everyone, which is the only reason he is now the most famous Egyptian who ever lived. When they finally found that stairway and cleared it and came to the sealed door at the bottom and made a small hole in the top left corner of it, the man who was leading the dig held up a candle and put his eye to the opening. And for a long time he did not speak, and someone behind him asked whether he could see anything, and he said yes, wonderful things. Behind that door were the things we had never seen, not the picked-over bones of a robbed tomb, the real thing, as they had left it. Chariots taken apart to fit through the door, beds, chairs, chests full of clothes, walking sticks, jars of oil, boxes of food, still sealed, board games with the pieces still in them, 2 life-sized figures of the king, standing guard on either side of the sealed door of the burial chamber, facing each other in the dark, holding their staffs exactly where the priests had set them down 3,000 years before, having stood there through every night of every year of all those centuries, guarding a door that no one came to. And inside, the coffins. One inside another, and inside the last one, made of solid gold, wrapped in linen that had gone brown and brittle with the resin, was the boy with a mask of gold over his face. That face. You have seen it. Everyone on this earth has seen it. It is on posters and postcards and coffee mugs. It is a shorthand for the whole ancient world, and it has become so familiar that we forget what it actually is. It is a portrait of a teenager who died, made by people who loved him and did not want him to be forgotten. And it is the only one we have. Everything else, all the other kings, all the other gold, all the other faces, went into the fire and the melting pot thousands of years ago. We have one, out of all of them. And we have it because of a pile of rubbish, and the digging has never stopped. Right now, tonight, while you lie there in the dark, there are people in that country crouched in the sand under the desert stars with brushes and trowels, working by lamplight, clearing a shaft that no one has looked into since it was filled in. They go down through the rubble, foot by foot, sieving everything. They find a plastered wall, they find a name, they find a doorway that no living person has ever walked through, sealed with clay that still carries the fingerprints of the man who smoothed it, and they open it, and there is the smell of very old air, and the dust hanging in the torchlight, and coffins stacked in the dark, and painted walls as bright as the day the brush left them, and a family still together, still where they were laid. They find priests who served a god for a lifetime, and their wives, and their children, and their little wooden servants standing in rows in their boxes ready to answer. Sometimes they find something that stops the whole excavation cold, a wall of pure color, untouched. A shaft full of sealed coffins, dozens of them, stacked like books. A workshop where the embalmers worked, with the jars and the bowls still standing in the corner, and the residue still in the bottom of them, and you can put it under a machine and find out exactly what they were made of, and where the ingredients came from, and how far they traveled and what it cost. They are still coming up out of the ground, every year, thousands of them. In one place, a shaft holds 100 coffins. In another, a corridor holds 100 more. 4,000 years of the dead, patiently waiting under the sand, being lifted back up one at a time into the light. And it is found. In the end, everything is found. That is the great and terrible irony of the whole story, and it is the thing I keep turning over. They wanted, above all things, to be left alone, sealed, undisturbed, safe in the dark, with their name on the wall. And what happened instead is that we came, with brushes and lamps and cameras and scalpels. We opened the doors they sealed. We unwrapped the linen they wound so carefully. We took the little charms out of the wrappings and laid them on trays. We put their bodies into machines and looked through them, and counted their teeth, and found out what they ate, and what they suffered from, and how old they were when they died, and sometimes how they died. We know that one great king had terrible arthritis. We know another had bad teeth that must have caused him agony. We know the boy king had a broken leg, and a foot that made him limp, and that he walked with a cane. Everything they hid we know, and yet, think about what they actually asked for. Go back to the beginning of all of this. What did they want, more than anything, more than gold, more than the tomb itself? They wanted the body to be preserved. They wanted the face to remain so it could be recognized, and above all, above everything, they wanted the name to be spoken. Because a name spoken aloud in the world of the living was the thread that kept a person from vanishing. To be forgotten was the real death. To have your name said was to be, in some small way, still here. So, their bodies are preserved. They lie in climate-controlled rooms, watched over more carefully than any priest ever watched them, tended by people who have devoted their whole lives to keeping them safe. Their faces remain. You can go and look at them. You can stand a foot away from a man who ruled the world 3,000 years before you were born, and look at his face, and see the shape of his nose, and the set of his jaw, and the way his hands are crossed on his chest, and their names. Their names are spoken every single day in every language on earth by millions of people who will never see the Nile. Children learn them in school. They are printed in books, said aloud in museums, whispered by tourists standing in the dark of a tomb, spoken in 1,000 documentaries, said tonight, right now, by me, and heard by you, wherever you are. They ask to be remembered. They are the most remembered people who have ever lived. They did not get the afterlife they planned. The tombs were robbed, the seals were broken, the little servants never answered anyone's call, and the painted bread was never eaten, and the boats never sailed. But the thing they wanted underneath all of it, the thing all the gold and stone and linen was only ever a means to, they got. Completely. Beyond anything they could have dreamed. A farmer's son, who carved a name into a wall in the dark, hoping some priest would read it aloud once a year, is now spoken of by strangers on the other side of the world in a language that did not exist when he was alive, 4,000 years after his heart was weighed. The scales came down level after all, so let it be quiet now. Let the desert be dark and cool, and the great stone shapes stand black against a sky full of stars, and the river run on in the valley below, the way it has run for all of this, through every dynasty and every robbery and every empire, carrying its water north to the sea. Let the tombs be still. Let the little wooden servants stand in their rows in the dark with nothing to do. Let the painted fields on the walls go on growing their painted barley in rooms where no light has fallen for 3,000 years. Let the traveler have made it. Let the gates have opened. Let the serpent have been driven back one more time, and the boat have come through, and the morning have come up red over the eastern desert, the way it always does, the way it always has. Let the heart be light, and let it be enough tonight to know that a very long time ago, in a narrow green country beside a great river, people who are dust now loved each other so much that they could not accept goodbye. So they built houses of stone in the desert, and they filled them with bread, and they wrote out the words, and they laid their dead down gently in the dark, with a little charm over the heart. And they said, "We will see you again. There is nothing left for you to do. The door is sealed, the night is long, and the boat is moving, and the light is small, but it does not go out. Close your eyes. Let the sand drift up against the door. Let the stars turn slowly over the desert. Let the long quiet of 4,000 years come up around you like warm water. And sleep now. The morning always comes."